Okay, so I think we're going to get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have friends here from not, not only all around the state of Wisconsin, but all the way across the country. And I welcome you, whether you're here from RRC or CRS, or if you're joining us from Women's Council or GMAR or NAR's Young Professional Network. Lots of you were invited, and we're grateful for every one of you for being here. Thank you. We hope that you're going to learn something valuable today, and we know that you're going to love our guest speaker, Cori Lamont. If you're not familiar, you might be asking, what is RRC? And the Residential Real Estate Council is the leading education and networking organization for residential real estate agents. We welcome you to join us and to check us out at crs.com. RRC awards the prestigious CRS designation, which is awarded to experienced realtors who complete advanced training and demonstrate outstanding achievement in the industry. Our Wisconsin leaders are here to help you if you're interested in learning more about CRS or what events we have planned to help realtors grow their business. You can visit us on Facebook or at wisconsin.crs.com. And you'll see some of us here on the Zoom today. If you're available next week, Tuesday, we have a Region 5 RRC event. We've invited some listing leaders from around the Midwest to talk on listing strategies. So our guest today is Wisconsin's very own Cori Lamont. Cori's the Senior Director of Legal and Public Affairs at the Wisconsin REALTORS Association, and she's one of our greatest treasures. She's beloved by our realtor community, and she's known for advocating for our industry and fighting for rules and laws that help wrap us in bubble wrap to protect us against, well, others, but really ourselves. And so we welcome her, and thank you for joining us, Cori.
Well, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. For those of you that don't know me, I've been with the association, gosh, over 17 years now. I started in the pre-license education, so I've come up with you through your foundation of having pre-license, and now moved over several years ago to the legal and lobbying department and help out with your continuing education as well as all of your advocacy efforts, legal and government affairs. So one of the things that I am super excited to talk to you about today is all of this competitive market information. So we have been, just like you, busy. So what we can always tell are trends occurring through conversations on hotline, but we can also certainly start to feel when the market's picking up because our call intake has picked up. So 2020 was a busy year for us, and 2021, like you, continues to be a busy year. So when I say I understand somewhat of what your busyness is like, I'm empathetic, but I certainly know that you are in a much more difficult position because you're getting to talk to us for just a few moments, and then we have the opportunity to kind of hang up, talk to another one of you while you guys are still living and breathing your transactions. And I know they're challenging to say the very least. So my goal today is to try to help you understand a little bit about COVID and how it impacted some of our conversations to now post-ish COVID. I recognize we're still in unique circumstances, but as far as kind of definitely the trends that we're seeing now that we're kind of getting back to this normalcy, if you will, of life beyond being homebound because of COVID. So what my goal is today was to talk to you about it from a buyer's perspective, a seller's perspective, and then you as an agent, and then take some questions from you. And then if time permits, I'll go through a couple of other talking points and things that we're seeing as trends or other things that we'd like you to tune into the WRA and some of our legal update lives that we have coming as to some new education opportunities for you to learn about new legislation. So as far as COVID, obviously there were always lots of conversations as far as making sure people remain safe. How do you do showings? We had lots of addenda. We saw the unique things being drafted in contracts. I always personally, and this is now one I'm going to tell forever about the fact that in part of the deep part of COVID, I even had an agent share with me just a snippet of the contract language where the buyer actually asked the seller they negotiated for all the toilet paper in the house to be left as part of the contract, just purely because of the fact that people were so concerned about some of those elements when it came to paper goods. So when I say that we see the trends, we see the trends. And so in the last several months, as you know, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, man, it brought out some competitiveness. When I say that it brings out competitiveness, that's between buyers, sellers, agents, and unfortunately, sometimes that creates a negative effect for us as far as maybe some of the lack of kindness, impatient, and sometimes a little bit of questionable maybe ethics or professionalism that we hear being given to us through the hotline. And again, it's always just word of mouth that we sometimes hear about this. But what it's also doing is creating some really risky behaviors. Some creative contract drafting certainly has created some challenges for you in making sure you're protected, as Jean indicated. And I always laugh and say that as one of the legal team members, I always look at it as my goal is to help protect you. So I tell you to put the mouth guard on, I tell you to put the helmet on, I put the elbow pads and the knee pads on you. And, we start to then wrap you up, and then we put you in a seatbelt that's more like a race car seatbelt as opposed to a traditional car seatbelt. So like our job is here to protect you. And every one of those safety mechanisms that you take off as you got informed from us about the things when it comes to the baseline of the law and concerns and best practices, the more that you step away from that more conservative position that we take, of course, then at some point you're informed at least about the risk that you're taking. When you're getting into such a competitive market, it's really hard for you, I recognize, to be able to kind of remember all of that, right? To remind the buyer of the risks of not writing an offer without a financing contingency or a home inspection. And so one of the things is for us just to help you step back in this very busy market and just remember the bigger picture. Obviously, the goal is always to make sure we're servicing our clients and our customers to meet their objectives. And also always to put a good reputation out there as the community of realtors. But certainly, when it comes to what buyers and sellers want in their contracts, that's their prerogative. So your goal is to trying to navigate that conversation with them. So first and foremost, one of the things that we started seeing really early on, especially in the deep part of COVID, were buyers that said, I don't want to go into the property, I'm just going to write sight unseen. That is their prerogative. They can certainly do that. For you as an agent, though, there's still a time where you actually have to go in and inspect the property. And I put quotes around inspect because that's what the administrative rule says, that you have to inspect the property. So one of the things that we always have to be mindful of is the fact that just because the buyer doesn't have to see the property, you do at some point as the real estate licensee. And we also recognize that sometimes you're being asked to write offers, at midnight or 2 a.m. in the morning. And so trying to get into that property, I also know is not something that's feasible. So we're working with the Real Estate Examining Board and through the administrative codes to try to figure out the interpretation when it comes to how do I say that I couldn't gain access to the property? Is it because the seller wouldn't allow me? Is it because of the time of day that I was being asked to write the offer? And so we're recognizing that there are some just logistics that occur for you that can create that challenge and making sure that you're meeting your obligations as a real estate licensee. The other thing that we're often seeing, and again, no surprise to you, cash, no financing. And so when you have these buyers that are saying, I'm good, even though, and this has always been the case, we have lots of buyers that would write offers as cash. And so that's when you go into the WB11, and I'm going to talk about this more in the context of that traditional residential transaction. Then you would, instead of checking the box for the financing commitment contingency, you then have if this offer is not contingent on financing, right? And so that's that proof of funds that we tend to talk about. If it's left blank or you put in the default, it's 7 days. And so that's when your buyers certainly could sit there and say, I know I still have to get financing, but I know it's going to make my better offer if I don't have a financing commitment contingency, so I'm not going to include it. So the offer to purchase does kind of acknowledge the fact that a buyer, it may still have, you can obviously have no financing commitment contingency and still have an appraisal contingency. So if you have a cash, no financing offer, but you have an appraisal contingency, then if you're still within that time frame as a buyer for the appraisal and the property doesn't appraise out because you wrote well above list, and I'm going to pretend at this point we haven't added any extra language about buyer kind of making up the appraisal difference. So if they write cash, they have an appraisal contingency and it's still within the time frame, then the buyer can say the property didn't appraise out. If there's no appraisal contingency and it's cash, they still have the right to have an appraiser come in under all of these circumstances when it's cash, because it's on lines 304 to 305 in the WB11. But there's still kind of some challenges here and there, but they just don't have that appraisal contingency to give them that safety net, if you will. If they have a financing with no appraisal contingency, just like it's always been. If they give, you know, a loan commitment, then the loan commitment is going to be subject to conditions. One of those most common conditions is an appraisal. So if they have given their financing loan commitment, then they basically said financing is no longer a hurdle and they're all good to go. If they have not been given their loan commitment, and I know someone asked this question in the pre-submitted questions, if they have a financing commitment contingency with no appraisal and they have not given their loan commitment and the property doesn't appraise out, then the lender can say they don't qualify for the loan and they can give a rejection letter. This is, again, if we're still within that time frame. So again, if you give the loan commitment, that's why the contract itself tells you in 3 different components as a buyer. It's a big deal when you give the loan commitment. Such a big deal that it basically says financing is no longer an issue for me. And so that's why we added that new language in there that says if they've signed a loan commitment, or if there's some sort of document that says, yes, I'm good, I don't need to, you know, I've given written direction for delivery. That's why we added that new language in the financing commitment contingency. So again, I'll answer some additional questions I see a couple of chats, so I'll kind of double back because I see one's not related right to the financing and appraisal conversation. If there is no appraisal contingency, then other than just having a financing contingency, then again, if the property doesn't appraise out, they're still within their time frame, they haven't given the loan commitment, then they'd be able to have some wiggle room. If they have no financing commitment contingency, no appraisal contingency, then they're saying, here it is, I'm going to give you my proof of funds, and then what is proof of funds, right? So you have this whole conversation. And so in the revisions to the WB11 we did a while ago, one of the big conversations was, well, how do we know if it's good enough, right? So in the offer to purchase, it actually says reasonable written verification from a financial institution or third party in control of the buyer's funds. And then it says, at the time of verification, sufficient funds to close. So that again, if the buyer's sitting there saying, man, I don't know if the way I want to do proof of funds is actually going to fulfill that sub item 1, then they could certainly include in the blank lines in item 2 what they'd like to say is my proof of funds. Like, I have a 401k that I'm willing to pull money out, or I have stocks that I'm wanting to liquidate. Those are ways that the buyer can say, I know it may not meet the sub 1, but I want to use these as my proof of funds. I'm going to put that into the contract, and then the seller can say, you know, I'm going to counter that, I don't really like it. Or they can say, yeah, that's cool. But if the buyer is concerned that how they want to do proof of funds may not meet that sub 1, then they need to negotiate for that so they can ensure that they know that the seller is going to be okay with the proof of funds they're trying to offer. The no inspection is obviously a big one for a buyer. If the buyer is saying, I don't want to have an inspection contingency, I'm going to talk about the fact as an agent, you're going to want to have some sort of paper trail. I know someone talked about hold harmless for the seller and the agents and the firms. I'm certainly going to talk about that in a minute, but there's a huge risk. I don't have to tell you that. We always recommend that buyers have home inspections because of the fact that the first thing that every buyer needs to know is I'm not a qualified home inspector. That's not my technical expertise. That's not my expertise at all. I'm not here to help you with the condition of the property. I recognize I have disclosure of material adverse facts obligations, but I'm not a trained home inspector. And the only person that's going to help you understand the condition of the home is going to be that home inspector or some other qualified expert that's going to help you with that component. So again, we want to make sure that the buyers understand if they decide not to have a home inspection, that they're trying to say, I want to be competitive. I get it. But there's also lots of consequence with that. And so we want to make sure that as an agent that you have a paper trail where they've basically said, I acknowledge that. And so the other thing is obviously the over list. Lots of buyers are writing over list. I talked to an agent, I guess in the last couple of months, probably was much longer than that, but in the last couple of months who had a property in Madison they kept negotiating on. They were of $121,000 over list. And they lost it by $5,000. They saw once it closed. And so I recognize that this is absolutely insane, some of these marketplaces and the challenges that you guys are being confronted with. And so one of the things that someone suggested is, are agents doing their due diligence? Are they marketing? Are they doing their CMAs? Are you making sure that you're balancing everything? And the hardest part is, man, you just have no idea what people are willing. Everything's a moving target. We do know that sometimes the challenge is the fact that it may not appraise out, which is again why I understand that you're having some of these. I'm going to make up the difference of the appraisal I'm going to talk about in a second, because from a seller's perspective that can be good and bad. The one thing that we're starting to see a lot more of are these Dear Seller letters. The Dear Seller letters where basically, please sell your house to me because we are starting to really get a lot of pushback about the way we've come out about this discussion. So we actually created a Dear Seller document, and it's a resource that was just in yesterday's Hot Tips, just to remind you of the fact that this is an education kind of document where it talks about Dear Sellers being maybe a competitive edge that a buyer is trying to do, but it can also lead into fair housing conversations. If a buyer says, I want to be in this area because this is where I grew up, I have a special connection, I love the historic architecture, whatever it is, that's arguably okay. When they start saying, you know, my 3 children are going to live here with me, now you're starting to tell me more about who you are as a protected class, and that's where we get into trouble. And so for an agent, one of the things that we're telling you is be careful. Whether if you're going to have a buyer that's going to want to write one, that's obviously their prerogative, but you want to give them a general discussion about fair housing. That's why we have this new document for you. It's at wra.org/Dear Seller. Took me a second to find it. And so again, you don't want to review that letter. You don't want to tell them what's supposed to be included, what's not to be included. You're not going to edit that letter for them. But I even have some sellers, which we'll talk about in just a minute, that are saying, I don't even want to see any of those. And so we have to be very careful about these Dear Seller letters, which is why we've created this 1-page document as a resource for you. Escalation clauses, escalation clauses, those are my nemesis. So what is fun to be on Legal Hotline is the fact that you see trends happening and you hope certain trends or waves happen in other markets, and you hope certain trends and waves never hit other markets. And so I started noticing escalation clauses in Milwaukee about 3 years ago. And then it kind of made its way through other markets like Madison and the Fox Valley. And now they're just kind of everywhere. And the challenge is everybody's got different versions. And so when you call us and you say, hey, what does this mean? I have 4 offers. They all have escalation. It's a mess. And I get that. One of the things that we've been asked is, does WRA have some sort of addendum, an escalation clause addendum? We don't have an escalation clause addendum, but we do have an escalation clause that we kind of recommended. So for consistency's sake, that's something that some firms and other marketplaces have tried to adopt, just so that everybody's understanding, because there's always challenges and they can be very ambiguous depending on who's reading them and who's writing them. And so those are kind of the conversations. And so we do have a magazine article I wrote for January's magazine 2021, where it's just like the top tips when it comes to escalation clauses. And then what I've also done in that specific article is I've included the actual language of the escalation clause that we have. And escalation clauses are the same as acceleration clauses. We just don't generally in the legal community use acceleration clauses, because that's what we tend in real estate anyway, because that's what we tend to hear in mortgage documents. And so that's why you hear us call them escalation clauses. But if you call an accelerator clause, it's okay. It's not like you're wrong and you're banished forever. It's just that's the reason why you hear us have different verbiage from our perspective. The secondary offer priority, lots of buyers are saying, look, I get it at the seller's market, but if you have an offer that you've accepted that's primary, I'm going to come in as secondary. And if you raise a secondary, I want to be first. So those are those prioritizations. We've had language in our clause manual for years about that. So that's another way that we're having buyers say, okay, well, at least if I'm in this pool of secondary buyers, here's how I can find a way to get picked first if they end up having to elevate someone. And then closing costs, I understand that some of you are starting to see lots of fun ways to try to incentivize a seller to accept the buyer's offer. Maybe that's recommendation from the buyer, maybe that's a recommendation you've seen or language you've seen from somebody else, where you'll say, buyer will pay seller $4,000 at closing. Obviously, if there's a cash deal, that's a little bit different. Lenders don't typically like the buyer giving $4,000 to somebody else because they'd rather it be put towards their loan, but those are all different discussions. It's permissible to have something. It could be very clean and straightforward. There obviously could be tax consequences to a seller. Obviously, sellers at this point are just kind of content to make sure that they're getting as much for their house as possible, but cash at closing is something that we are starting to see some buyers trying to offer sellers, but there could be obviously consequences to that because it's taxable income. And so it could impact it a little bit that way. From the seller's perspective, again, all their prerogative. We do have some sellers that say, I don't want to see any Dear Seller letters. I don't want to consider them. I don't want to entertain them. If that's the case, as a listing agent, you're going to document that in the listing contract. That's going to be a directive from the seller. The seller says, I don't want to see any dear seller letters. And then you communicate that through whatever way that you can, through the MLS, through one sheet, whatever it is, through the showing line, however you can, to make sure that everybody's understanding that your seller will not be entertaining any dear seller letters in any offers. And that way, again, everybody can say, this is the seller's directive. It was in writing. I'm communicating it to you so that you know that's their directive and I'm not trying to discriminate. I do have some sellers, which would be no surprise if I were one. They don't want escalation clauses. They don't like the drama. They just say, look, I just write your highest and best and come back to me then, because I'm not going to go, you go up and you go down and you go up and you go down and then you fight. And so we have lots that will just say, I'm going to go highest and best. I'm going to choose one primary and then I'm going to put the rest of you in a pool of secondaries, because you can have as many secondary offers as you want. And then, of course, we have the ever favorite cash at close for the difference of the appraisal to the purchase price. I get it. I totally understand how, this is something that everybody's acknowledging, that we could be going above list and that we're concerned about the appraisal. The hardest part is if you check the box for the appraisal contingency as it's drafted in the WB11, it already tells you how the seller can remedy this, right? So if the seller does, if the property doesn't appraise out, then if the seller has the right to cure, A, B, and C can happen. Those already are there. When you've checked that box, you've laid those out. When you add additional language now that says you're going to now have this as a remedy, you've offered some additional remedy. And the hardest part for that is, for some, and we had a legal hot tip about it yesterday, it can create ambiguity into what the terms are between the parties. Most of the time the parties can figure it out, they amend, they get there, because everybody wants the deal to work. But this has been the biggest challenge about this appraisal contingency being checked and then this difference being made up at closing, this cash difference. So those are the challenges that we recognize. It's imperfect of how to figure it out. Again, sellers love these no contingency offers. Those have been big negotiations from a buyer's side. I've seen buyers that say, fine, I will say that I'm not going to have any contingencies, but I'm also now going to reduce the amount of earnest money, so that if I decide to walk, you're going to only take a certain amount of money from me as opposed to all of what I originally put in there. I, again, see a lot of sellers increasing the pool of secondary buyers because of the fact that they have lots of interested parties. So they're trying to build their secondary pool just in case the first one falls apart. We're having sellers that are kind of really in a great position, as you know, to say, go pound sand. If you don't like my terms, depending on what's happened, even after I've accepted, I've got other buyers in the pool waiting. In addition, I do know that some of you, and this has been something we've seen for a number of years, is this idea that the inspection contingency is actually going to have a defined amount of money when it comes to defect. So this is something that we've seen for years. The WB11 has never ventured into that discussion of trying to define defect as a certain cash value or a certain amount of money. The reason that this has historically not been the case is because $1,000 in one market might be very different than $1,000 in another. In addition, it's always been challenging to try to figure out who's going to determine that it's $1,000 fix. Magically, each party might have an incentive as to why they want it to be a little higher or a little lower. And so that's been always the reason that you haven't seen this really kind of gone into in the definition of defect in the offer to purchase. Certainly, I understand it, and you see 5,000, 1,000, whatever it is. As long as the parties understand what that number is and who's going to determine that number, that's going to be the challenge, I think, to make sure that expectations are met. And then I know that some of you asked about the bill of sale language. I know that someone said, the biggest concern I have about bill of sale is this idea that once you give it, you're giving me all your personal property. So only the seller signs it, and whatever we've negotiated as personal property in the offer to purchase, this bill of sale gives you that. And so someone said, I'm always afraid that it's going to be given to you early and that they're going to now give them all of their personal property, but they haven't successfully closed yet. The DSPS Forms Committee is actually kind of looking at this to try to figure out if it could have language in the bill of sale that says upon successful closing. But the reality is you can still negotiate for everything in your offer to purchase through your negotiations, amendment, counter, however you choose to do it. And you say it'll be referenced in a bill of sale, but the bill of sale will be executed at closing. And so those are the ways that you can kind of get around it. You don't have to give them the bill of sale at the time of negotiation. So I know that that is something that we were asked about in the series of questions. From the agent's perspective, man, you guys are busy. Man, you guys are getting you're getting a little feisty with each other. And I get it, right? It's a busy place to be right now. You're attending this. I know that competitive markets are a big deal to you. But the biggest concern that we're having right now are some drafting errors because you're writing offers so fast. I know I talked to an agent earlier today that had 40 offers on a property. Another one had 30 offers on a property. That's challenging, right? So if you're from a buyer's perspective, you're writing lots of offers, losing a lot of potential offers. And so I just want to caution you about making sure your drafting language is tight. That's why we have the WB11, right, to help you guide that language. But we're starting to see kind of some trends that we're not fans of. I love creativity. I absolutely love the fact that we're finding really cool ways to try to get buyers into properties, sellers getting deals to close. But part of the challenge sometimes when we draft fast or we draft creatively is we create vague language, ambiguous language. As I mentioned previously, the escalation clause is without a doubt one that we're starting to see because we're not using consistent language, and you're not going to see an addendum come out from the state of Wisconsin. So you're not going to see a WB escalation clause because, again, not everybody loves it, and we don't have any WB addenda at this time. But I do see a lot of concerns when it comes to the escalation clause because is it a one and done? How many times are you going to raise? Who do you compete against? So some of those are concerns. Sellers agreeing to allow buyers reasonable access into the property for inspections and tests or just for inspections and contractors. So what we're starting to see is instead of having an inspection contingency checked, the buyers say, I won't have an inspection, but I want to be able to have someone come in and do an inspection, recognizing that they have no inspection contingency. Well, when you start allowing them reasonable access into the house to allow the contractors and the inspectors to perform these inspections and provide bids, there's no deadline in this language. There's no term, no limits of how much they can do. And so when it doesn't have a contingency there that's kind of structured the who, what, when, where, how, and whatnot, who pays, then you have some challenges. And so, you just have to step back and remember those basic contract drafting tips. And I always say, and I know that it's very difficult in today's market, but if you have somebody else read your language that's not familiar with your transaction, they might look at it and go, what are you doing? I always use that replace the toilet example. Well, okay, you told me I had to replace the toilet in the powder room. All right, well, I'm going to replace it with the one my neighbor just took out from their 1970s remodel, right? It's new to my house. You didn't tell me make, model, color, any of those things. You didn't even tell me it had to be done by a professional. And so those are all those consequences. And let me assure you, you should not have me install anything in your house, especially a toilet. So those are the types of things that we just have to step back and remember. The Dear Seller letters, I've already alluded to the fair housing concerns. I know I'm talking really fast because I want to make sure I get to your questions. But again, don't tell them don't start telling them like, oh, you know what you should say? You should say this, or, I don't love this. You should put a comma there. Or, what else you should include is where your kids go to school. Like, don't guide them on content. If they want to write, just educate them about the fair housing concerns. And again, those Dear Seller page is a good resource because it's coming from the WRA. And that allows you to say, here are some concerns, buyer, seller, and that way you don't have to necessarily be the only one giving them those talking points. The informed decisions is a big part. I mentioned to you already the risk, all of these contingencies not existing in contracts, the risk that's associated with them. I know someone asked about in the questions submitted before today's discussion about the no inspection contingency, and now they're learning of a whole bunch of things after. Well, the buyer hopefully was educated by their agent. There's a paper trail by the agent that tells the buyer they're making an informed decision. They're acknowledging that the home inspection, that the agent advised for them to have a home inspection, that the buyer's waiving that opportunity, that they are understanding that the only person that can help them understand the condition of the property is this home inspector, that that's not the responsibility or scope within the real estate license for the agent. And then you make sure that they have some sort of acknowledgement. So this paper trail, when I say paper trail, it can be by email. I mean, not ideally by text, but you can certainly make sure you have this opportunity. I know I have one board in the Northeast that essentially says, like, you acknowledge this, and they have all these waivers. If you don't do this, then this. If you don't do this, then this. It's, again, just trying to make sure that they understand you're making this decision. You recognize the risks associated with it. and that I told you about these. And again, it's their priority, their contract, but it's just to help make sure that they're educated, but also kind of candidly protecting you. I believe if we protect you, we help protect the consumer. And so it's just educating them. The other thing I want to be very careful as agents is making sure that you're not making the decisions for the parties. If they decide as a seller that they don't want to have any showings, that's up to them. It's not something that we're trying to be too creative or too showy with. No offers until a certain date and time is a big trend that we saw for a while there. Again, if the seller is saying that that's what they want, that's very different. Or if you're having this conversation with the seller about one of the paths we can take, that's fine. But just making that unilateral decision, that one-sided decision for the seller, you said, this is the way we're going to do it. I'm a little cautious about that for you because of the fact that you need to make sure they understand a bigger picture. And then again, suggesting dear seller letters, seller side, buyer side, just making sure they understand it, that you're not making those decisions on their behalf. I know I also had a question about hold harmless for sellers and firms. I know we love the idea of the hold harmless, right? So I've already informed you about the risks of not having an inspection contingency, a financing contingency, whatever it is. And now you're going to hold the seller harmless and my firm harmless and myself harmless because you waive these things. If it makes you feel good, makes you feel good. All right. But it's not going to stop lawsuits, and it's not going to stop DSPS complaints or potential ethics complaints. So I don't want you to have any misleading impressions of this. I don't want you to make the seller believe that this is all we need to do to lock you up and you'll be good. You won't have any risk associated with you. No, it's just, again, I recognize the opportunity that we're trying to take to hold harmless in these circumstances, but it just makes you feel good. It's not bulletproof. So I just want to make sure that we're being honest with the consumer and with you about that. And then the last thing I'll talk about really quickly, obviously lumber prices are going through the roof. Adding almost $40,000 to a build today. Just if you're in the market where you're helping negotiate building contracts, please note that builders are currently starting to implement escalation clauses because of these inflation and the increasing costs of lumber. And so they're locking it in for, I don't know, 2 months, and then they're saying we can escalate the price. And so that's, again, they're trying to recoup their costs associated with these lumber prices. And I don't necessarily see those costs going down at this time. All right, so let me take a breath here and see if I can help with any questions that I see within the chat, or if Jean wants to take something, I'm happy to do that as well.
I typed this in the chat, but just a reminder that Cori's here as our guest from the WRA, and she's giving us some general advice, but she's not giving you specific legal advice. And we recommend that you consult your state, if you're not from Wisconsin, your own attorney and your broker about what language you should use and how you should proceed in some of these scenarios. And also just a reminder that we do have a link. We're recording this, and that link will go out to everybody who registers so that you'll have the chance to be able to rewatch this if you want to. So I know there were some questions in the chat, but I also know that a couple of us on the leadership team had questions. Lisa, I don't think yours has been addressed yet. Would you like to go first and ask yours?
Yes, mine is about the escalation clause. I have a real problem with giving my clients personal email to the seller. I understand that we can't read the contract or anything, but is there a way to write an escalation clause without giving your personal email to anyone?
Yeah, so the trick is when you have an escalation, great question. The trick with the escalation clause is the fact that you're going to get ready to start sharing information about other offers, right? So as real estate licensees, we deem that to be confidential. So therefore, we can't share what other contracts prices are. So it becomes a bit of a catch-22 for us as real estate licensees when the escalation clause is included. In our escalation clause, we do put in there that licensees will not be providing that information. We don't intentionally include how that can be executed. So it sounds like maybe you guys in the marketplace are using email in order to get the seller and buyer to communicate. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand why that is a nightmare for you. I will tell you, it's funny because when we were going through all of the electronic consent and email delivery discussion, when I talked to agents and attorneys from other states, they were like, I don't understand. Why is everybody so cautious about sharing the contact information with each client and customer with each other? Buyers and sellers in our state have each other's contact information all the time. So there's definitely some sort of timidness that we have. And I'm sure it's probably just from the confidentiality. If you're not willing to share the email address or have concerns, then, I mean, the reality is the parties would have to mail it to one another. You know, that doesn't seem perfect because you can't facilitate that conversation. So I'm not sure off the top of my head. It's a great question. I'm not sure other ways that that can be shared unless there's some sort of cloud experience that they could execute.
Could you write, is there a possibility to rewrite an escalation clause in that instead of sharing that information, that the seller present a counter to one party only at an escalated price? Is that permissible?
I mean, you already know how I feel about escalation clauses. So I would love them if they just went away forever. Excuse me, I'm getting all choked up now. I mean, is it possible that you could design it to be a certain way? Yes. I'd have to work through what that looks like when you have more than one escalation clause involved in, you know, the 40 offers and 30 of them have escalation clauses. If your seller gives a counter to each one of those, then we've got a problem because then they've basically potentially said that I accept all of those 30 offers. So I think that that's the immediate challenge I have with the counter offer. So I'd have to work through that, probably not on the spot, to try to figure out if there's a different way of communication. It's something for me to take back to the legal team without a doubt.
You can certainly try anything, right? If it works.
Yeah, sort of.
I have a question about escalation clauses. This has just always bugged me about them. So if it's not okay for us as licensees to share a contract of someone else's, why is it okay for us to direct somebody else to do it? Isn't that like them doing it by proxy? And why don't we just outlaw that?
Well, we can't regulate the buyers and sellers. It's their property, their contract. So the law can only regulate real estate licensees. So that's why the law itself can say that we can't share confidential information, which terms of an offer are confidential, but we can't tell the seller. So to not say anything. That's why sometimes your sellers, you know, run at the mouth, for lack of a better phrase. Not that they have any ill will, but they start shooting off the hip, talking at a party or whatever, and all of a sudden now they want to have a different person buy their property because they're not held to the same regulatory standards that we are because they're not licensed. So we can't regulate them the same way, even though sometimes we want to.
Cori, Kathy Shaw wrote a question again about the integration clause. It says, can a compliance broker, we see the question.
I do. No, so licensee is licensee. The fact that you may be in your mind more detached because you're a compliance officer or a broker of the firm. And so this concept of, well, I'm once removed, I'm an arm's length. That's not how it works. Real estate licensees just can't share the terms. So it doesn't matter if you tried to hand it off to someone else, it wouldn't work because of the fact that licensees in totality can't do it. And now, attorneys, ironically, are not held to the same standards, sorry, unless they're real estate licensees.
So Tina Catalanati is asking, can the sellers send the other Bonafide offer to the buyer's agent?
Well, obviously, the sellers can do whatever they want. So possibly, yes, because we can't regulate the seller. So if the sellers decide to start sending it to others, that's up to the seller. And then at that point, as a buyer's agent, I mean, you've got it. What you do with it, that's going to be obviously an ethics discussion.
Maureen Stallet has a question about appraisals. Maureen, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask Cori.
Hey, Cori, could you clarify the appraisal contingency? If a buyer has a financed offer, but is not making a contingent upon appraisal, maybe they're willing to make up the difference, but if it's not contingent upon appraisal and it comes in low, can they use the appraisal as a reason to get out of the offer?
Right. So if I'm understanding, they have a financing contingency, a commitment contingency, and no appraisal contingency. Right. So for years, we didn't have an appraisal contingency in our contract, in our WV11. And so it was always the case that no loan is going to be provided unless the property appraises out. So as long as the buyer hasn't given a loan commitment to the seller, and then the property doesn't appraise out, then the lender could say, we reject the loan, you're rejected because of the fact that you can't, if the property doesn't appraise out, so it doesn't qualify for the mortgage. So they could give a rejection letter and walk. And I'm using this as clean. That's what the contract says, not that any other language has been added in the additional provisions.
Okay. I think that when it was added to the contract, we all assumed that you had to add an appraisal contingency if they needed to get, if it needed to appraise to get the loan. But you're saying it's not necessarily.
Well, it always had to appraise to get the loan, right? So the challenge was back when we added the appraisal contingency, which it's had 2 or 3 iterations since it was added. This most recent one had the right to cure added to it. But when it was originally added, it was almost a direct reflection of what was happening in the market. So you had buyers that wanted to be able to give the loan commitment, but they couldn't get the appraisal done in time to get the loan commitment. They wanted to show that they in good faith were moving forward. And so this appraisal contingency, in my mind, was a safety net. That's the way I used to train it, right? So you had your financing commitment contingency, or it was called financing contingency at the time. And then you check the box for the appraisal contingency. And if the financing contingency was 30 days, then in my mind, you would automatically make the appraisal contingency longer because we were having a hard time getting the appraisals done. So you make it 45 days. If you give your loan commitment and you've said it's no longer a hurdle, then you still had, and we'll just pretend that we were meeting those deadlines. You had 15 days then to have the appraisal come in. If the property didn't appraise out, then the buyer had the right to walk under the appraisal contingency because it didn't meet the purchase price or greater.
Okay. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective.
That's where it came from. And of course, now everything's totally different in every market.
Mm-hmm.
Paula Gowacki, sorry if I mispronounced that. She's asked,
Yes.
do you have a GMAR in every offer to purchase? I imagine she's talking about the GMAR Addendum A to be included in every offer to purchase.
Could we include the GMAR Addendum A in every offer to purchase?
I don't know, do we have?
Okay, so
No.
I'll explain.
Go for it.
So I don't include an addendum A if I don't need, I'm not requesting anything, seller's credits, any further testing, or home warranty program, right? Shore West is required, it's a request, like you have to have it in the offer for them to even consider your offer, kind of a thing. So I'm just wondering, do we have to have it, or can we just not have it if we're not requesting anything?
Sure. So let me step out here for just a second. We don't need to name any names of any firms, just I want to step out there. And I also should repeat the fact that I'm not here to trump any of your company policies. So if your company has a policy where they say you're going to do X, Y, and Z, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, because you have your federal law, your state law, your code of ethics, and then your office policy. All of those can build off of one. They can't take away another. And so I do want to put that there. There is no legal obligation in the state of Wisconsin to have an addendum placed in your contract. So when I say that, you do have to have lead-based paint disclosures, right? So however your company facilitates that, WRA created an addendum S to help. The Greater Milwaukee or GMAR Addendum A was drafted and created decades ago to try to help market-specific matters. So can you use a GMAR Addendum A in Madison? Yeah. Can you use a South Central or a Central Addendum in Greater Milwaukee? Absolutely. They may not match up. The reason that you may not have to draft it is because, like you said, you don't have anything that your parties need, and that would be your buyer's directive. And so again, it's all going to be based on the market and what needs are there. But if you don't have to include the Greater Milwaukee Addendum or any addendum by a local board for that matter in order for it to be presented or drafted. It's just because there are such market-specific issues in there, like in GMAR's Addendum A, there's the TRID information, right? So sometimes it just helps facilitate some of those conversations.
Jeff had a drafting question. Jeff, do you want to unmute and ask Cori?
Sure, and I know, hi Cori, I know that the legal folks get a little nervous when we start striking the language, the pre-printed language in the offers, but specific to appraisal. You mentioned, the remedies are already built in there. Is it preferred that if we're changing some of that language to do it in the additional provisions, or like, and I'll call myself out, I've done this a couple of times now where instead of having it say the appraised value for property equal to or greater than the agreed upon purchase price, I've just stricken the agreed upon purchase price and replace that with the list price of whatever the list price was. And then couple lines down where it says appraised value, the remedy, appraised value less than the agreed upon, it says purchase price, just strike purchase. Then not adding anything else. I guess, is that a better way to keep those remedies in place without kind of getting into a gray area? Or do you prefer that we leave that alone and create a new additional provision that talks about that at the end?
Right, good question. And they're all good questions if I didn't say that before. So when it comes to the pre-printed language, as real estate licensees, we're boxed in a little bit as to what we can utilize and as far as form language. So when there's a WB form, we are required to use that as Wisconsin real estate licensees. We have the ability to strike language at the direction of our parties, the instruction of our parties. And so you can strike the pre-printed language. That's something you're able to do. You have to leave it legible behind so that people can see what you're removing. If you choose to delete certain language and you're not adding any, you can certainly do that at the instruction of your party. If you choose to strike something and you want to insert something different, you wouldn't kind of strike and then do like the little caret and start writing. You would actually utilize the additional provisions. If you're making more changes to a contingency, then it becomes kind of hard to read back and forth. It may just be best to have an entirely different contingency included. And so if you use our clause manual, for example, or you're familiar with it, we offer lots of different opportunities. So every transaction is unique. And so sometimes this appraisal contingency won't meet the needs. And so there's different options and for different reasons that we have included in our our materials. So some of it, Jeff, is going to depend on how much you're modifying. If you're just eliminating language at the instruction of your party, and then you think that everybody's understanding what the language is intended to mean, then it would appear as though you'd be okay. That's my long way of saying I can't give you specific legal advice, but trying to talk to you about the different ways that you can modify forms.
Britton Keck, she has a question. We would love to hear what you have to say about the inspection contingency as regards to the entire premises, and if writing this language covers any and all inspections, even if not called out as a defect by the home inspection. So you don't have to write specific inspections like roof, foundation, etc., in order to do it.
So little known, maybe not known fact about me is I absolutely love the inspection contingency. It is one of my all-time favorite things to teach, to discuss, to train. It is our #1 most commonly asked question on the legal hotline when it comes to contract drafting. It comes to the inspection contingency, and it doesn't matter if someone's 5 seconds into the business or they're 50 years into the business. There's always good conversation when it comes to the inspection contingency. So in the last iteration of the WB11 revisions, it was modified to try to lay out that there are different types of inspections that occur during the inspection contingency. You have the one that's completed by the Wisconsin Registered Home Inspector. Then you have any component parts that you're going to list in there. And then you also have the opportunity as a buyer to have any in the inspection report, any written follow-up inspections. And so those are the 3 different types. That's why they were broken down that way. Entire premises is not appropriate to put into the inspection contingency. I know that that's something that has been, since I've been here the 17 years, it's been a constant training item that I keep trying to tell people. The home inspectors have their obligations as to what they inspect. Entire premises is not something that's defined by their terms, and it's not defined by the contract itself. So entire premises is not necessary to be included in the inspection contingency because it's in some respects vague. So if the home inspector does do their home inspection, they, as of June 1st, and this is one of the things I wanted to promote to you guys, is on May 27th at 10 a.m. We're going to have a legal update live. Jennifer Lindsley and I are going to talk about the new home inspector law and what the new home inspector report is going to have in it. As of June 1st, every home inspector has to use the word defect when they're identifying items as defects in the report. And we're going to talk about what that means. In addition, they're going to have a summary page included. So this whole home inspector didn't call it a defect item. Some of these questions that maybe are concerns that you've been embattled with in transactions will be alleviated. I can't fix everything in the legislature, or we can't, but it's certainly something that we're attempting to create consistency so that you're not hearing major issues, significant concerns, safety issues, all to describe what's by definition a defect. And so hopefully when home inspectors, they're already currently required to identify items as defects in their inspection or during their inspection. They're just not legally obligated to call them defects in their report. That's what changes as of June 1st. So the May magazine, I wrote a cover article about it. There's a May legal update. In the June magazine, the Home Inspectors Association has written an article. And then Jennifer and I will be doing that legal update live for the discussion about the home inspector legislation. So I think I kind of hit most of that question in some respect.
What is the particulars on that live event?
It's going to start being promoted. We have another one this week, so you're not hearing it heavily, but it's going to be May 27th at 10 a.m. It'll be short. It's 30 minutes.
And Cori, the change on June 1st, does it also include the home inspectors operating under the same definition of defect that we have in the offer? That's something we were working on, right? But
so 2 sessions ago, we actually updated. So home inspectors used to be, they used to use the verbiage material adverse facts. So 2 sessions ago, we said, look, everybody else uses the word defect when it comes to the transaction, seller's disclosure and condition report, offer to purchase uses defect when it talks about the inspection. So we modified it to say defect in their statute. And the one thing is and we modified it at that time to be substantially similar to the definition of the offer to purchase. I will be truthful that the only thing that we can't get included into the definition for a home inspector and defect is value. So the offer to purchase talks about significant value. That is something home inspectors can't comment about value. They can't tell somebody whether they should buy something worth its value. They can't be appraisers. And that's why they're essentially not able to comment on value. So that is one way that it does differ.
Cori, just to clarify Maureen Scale's question in regards to the appraisal and loan commitment. So could you reiterate on that fact about if the appraisal comes in low and you're wrote an offer as cash, as a financing, however, the appraisal happened after the loan commitment is delivered, can the buyer get out?
Okay, so you've checked the box for financing. They've given the loan commitment. The appraisal's now done, and it doesn't appraise out. You have lost your opportunity to kill the deal. You can't. So here's what's going to happen. The lender's not going to issue the loan, but the buyer's contractually committed to close on the property, at least when it comes to the financing. Because when you give a loan commitment, and the contract says this, even if it's subject to conditions, which typically it's going to say subject to appraisal if it hasn't occurred, they've said that financing is no longer a hurdle. So if they have a financing contingency, they give a loan commitment, they don't have an appraisal contingency, but they have an appraisal done, and the property doesn't appraise out for purchase price or higher, they're contractually committed to purchase the property, even though they know they're not going to get the loan.
And Alice, clarify, Bush, that was your question.
Can I clarify? I think what she's asking is you have not delivered loan commitment, right? Appraisal comes in before loan commitment is delivered and it does not appraise. Can you cancel the contract if the lender won't lend, even though you do not have an appraisal contingency, if the lender will not lend based on appraisal?
Yes, because this is the way the world existed before we had an appraisal contingency. So if there is a financing commitment contingency and they have not given the loan commitment, and then the property gets appraised, and during this time the property appraises and it doesn't appraise for purchase price or higher. And again, this is the pre-printed language I'm addressing here, not creative ways that we're dealing with additional provisions. So they have a financing commitment contingency, no appraisal contingency. They have not given loan commitment yet. Property doesn't appraise out. Then the lender is going to say, I'm not giving you the loan, you're rejected, and they'll give the rejection letter or letters, depending on the discussion, to the seller.
That's the part we needed clarity on right there.
Cori, Tammy is asking, can a buyer bury a home sale contingency inside a financing contingency? They need the funds from their home sale to close, but to look competitive, do not want to include a contingency in the offer.
Good question.
I mean, they must like to swim with great white sharks too, because that's not my jam. Again, risk is risk, right? So I just talked to an agent who had a $2.5 million property listed, and the buyer wrote an offer without an inspection contingency. And all they wanted to do was, and no cash, it was cash. So all they wanted to do was buy that property, and all they wanted to do was be able to come in and have an inspection without an inspection contingency coverage. Learned through a follow-up inspection that they had repairs of over $30,000 to make. And the seller's like they stood their ground because of the fact that you didn't write an offer with a contingency for a home inspection. And so go pound sand. And the biggest fear you have in that moment is somebody can write a $2.5 million cash offer. You know that they can also hire legal counsel. And so, you know, you have to figure out how much you want to fight it. But if a buyer is willing to say, all right, I know I have to sell my house in order to buy a house, but I'm not going to make my offer contingent on it, eyes wide open, they might be making a very risky business decision, but they could do it.
Cori, in circumstance, with no inspection contingency, why is it that the buyer went in there?
They wanted to live in that neighborhood. They used to live in it. They were moving back. They'd been in that house 2 or 3 years prior at some party. And so they knew the house, the layout of it, and they wanted it.
But why, after they wrote the offer to purchase, did they want out of the contract? I mean,
because they didn't want to spend $30,000.
Who would let them in then?
The seller actually agreed through an amendment to allow them in, to allow the inspection to occur because they knew that they didn't have any hammer on them. So then the buyer tried to, you know, leverage them, and the seller kept standing their ground with appropriate legal counsel advice, not mine, their private legal counsel.
Sarah Hansen, you had a question a while back about delayed status. Did you want to jump in and ask that?
Yes, so when you mentioned that it was our obligation as an agent to inspect the property prior to writing an offer, if it isn't delayed status and our buyer instructs us to write a sight unseen, we can't accomplish that.
Actually, Sarah, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes. So Sarah, this is where I would argue that you would say you couldn't gain access, right? So this is one of those things, and I know I talk fast, so I apologize. But this is one of those examples where, you know, you would try to defend your position if a complaint were filed against you at the real estate examining board to say there was no access to the property because delayed status doesn't allow it. My buyer wanted to be aggressive and write an offer, so I didn't have the ability to access it. Once I did have the ability to access the property, I did my due diligence. And the good news is you have 5 real estate licensees on that real estate examining board of 7. They know your world. And so they can understand those consequences.
Just so everybody knows, we do have to end at 1, so we're getting close here. But Alexis Rizal, did you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, hi. So I've seen people not have any inspection contingency and add additional provisions to allow the buyer to do inspection for information purposes only. It beats me because it opens up a can of worms, and I can argue that they will walk out on financing contingency. And how do you deal with that? It's like, what's the reasoning behind it, if ever? Thank you.
Yeah, so my instincts are that buyers are trying to write competitive offers, and they say, look, I know I need to have the financing commitment contingency, like that's just my reality, but I'm really willing to write a risky offer because I know sellers hate inspection contingencies. And unfortunately, they kind of become known as these deal killers when really they're just more information builders. And so I think what you tend to have are some buyers that maybe think if I don't have an inspection contingency, but I have an opportunity to learn about the property, that will help me. If I were a seller, I wouldn't personally allow anyone to do that. But again, this is me personally, and I have trust issues, and I'm going to be aggressive in the way that I transact business compared to others. It's not a good thing. But I, as a seller, don't want anyone to come in and teach me anything about my property, and I don't want my agent to have to learn anything about my property. You either want my house or I don't, or you don't. And so in a seller's market, I can stand my ground. But I think that's why the buyers are making those riskier decisions, because they know sellers don't like inspection contingencies.
Thank you.
So we'll try to get one more in. Nikki, did you want to ask your question? Nikki was asking about, she says she's a little nervous about an offer her seller accepted on Sunday, cash, no contingencies. Buyer's agent then wants to get in Thursday night for measurements with the buyer. And they're wondering, can she ask if they're bringing a contractor through or an inspector because there's no inspection contingency?
Yeah, so if they have an accepted offer, the seller can certainly ask a series of questions about, you don't have the opportunity to bring certain individuals in. Obviously, you never know. Someone could say, no, it's my brother, you know, and they don't know that it's a contractor or a home inspector or whomever. It doesn't give them any sort of, you know, inspection rights. But yeah, if they actually have an accepted offer, they can limit who comes in the property.
And one last question, Stephanie, did you want to ask yours?
Yeah, just in regards to the earlier question regarding entire premises listed on point 2 of the inspection contingency. So we know it's not necessary to list that, but we've had arguments from agents saying that if they put in entire premises in point 2, then the buyer has been given authority to have a follow-up inspection, even if it's not listed or recommended in that general home inspection report. So we just want clarification and making sure that we are training correctly on that. And we are definitely listing individual components, and they're only given the authority if they list that individual component or if it's recommended in the general home inspection.
Right. So item number 3 talks about the follow-up inspections in the written report, either from the home inspector or those component authorized component inspectors, or, you know, the specialties in 2. Entire premises has no definition. It doesn't have any meaning to it. So the idea, and I can't imagine that someone believes that that allows something beyond what's written in the written inspection report, because entire premises doesn't give you, I don't know what it means. So I don't know what component it is that you're trying to get to. It doesn't mean, as a seller, would not accept any offer with that. And I don't necessarily encourage this continued drafting as part of the moving forward.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Cori, thank you so much for your time. We did it at lightning speed, but we got through. We covered a lot of ground. I feel really good about it. I hope everybody learned something and thought it was valuable. And I hope to see you again soon, Cori. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Take care.